She was just a girl, barely old enough to understand the full weight of war. And yet Jeanne d'Arc stood before kings, led armies, and claimed she heard the voice of God. She rose from obscurity in a broken, blood-soaked France, a teenager in armor, carrying the hope of a fractured nation on her back. But what happens when a girl becomes more powerful than the men who rule her? What happens when a child dares to lead, to challenge, to win? The church called her a heretic, the English called her a witch. But behind the whispered accusations was a darker fear. Jeanne d'Arc had become untouchable, and in a world ruled by men in robes and crowns, untouchable women are destroyed. She wasn't captured by enemies. She was betrayed by those who claimed to fight alongside her. The same church she defended turned against her, tried her, and condemned her in a courtroom cloaked in scripture and cruelty. At just 19, they stripped her of her dignity, shaved her head, and burned her alive before a cheering crowd. But death did not silence her. Her ashes whispered louder than her voice ever could. Jeanne's story is not one of defeat. It's a tale of calculated execution, of fear wrapped in ritual, of innocence consumed by power. This is not just a martyr's tale. This is a warning. She wasn't born with a sword in her hand. She was born in a crumbling farmhouse in Domremy, a village so poor even the rats scurried like they were late for prayer. The sky hung low over the thatched roofs, and the air smelled of wet soil and old wood. Jeanne was just a child, a barefoot girl with calloused hands, too young to carry the weight of angels or kings. And yet, the voices came. They didn't boom from the heavens. They crept in slowly. First as whispers when she was alone. Then as echoes in the barn while she collected eggs. Then louder, clearer, at the church altar where the candles flickered violently for no reason. The first time it happened, she thought she was cursed. She ran from the fields with her ears covered, her chest tight, and her breath trembling like a leaf in the wind. She told no one. Who would believe her? A poor girl hearing voices was not chosen. She was possessed. Every shadow stretched too long after that. The creak of her father's boots in the hall made her flinch. She began sleeping with her back to the wall and her hands gripped tight around a wooden cross. But the voices didn't leave. They began calling her name. Jeanne. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes while she was awake, they told her she was chosen by God, but she didn't feel holy. She felt hunted. Her body shook in church pews as priests read verses she didn't understand. Her lips mouthed prayers while her mind spiraled into confusion and guilt. Why her? Why now? She was just a girl with no armor, no voice, no power. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the shame. She began to believe the devil lived inside her, that maybe these voices weren't divine at all. Maybe she was just broken. She begged the saints to leave her alone. She cried into straw pillows until they were soaked through. She starved herself, hoping the hunger would quiet the voices, but they stayed. And then, they gave her orders. Go to the king, lead the army, save France. At first she laughed, hysterically, breathlessly, like someone dangling on the edge of madness. A girl who couldn't read or write, who bled during her moon cycle and trembled in storms, was being told to lead men into battle, but the voices didn't care. They came stronger, louder, with visions of fire, of swords, of coronations soaked in gold and blood. Her nights became feverish. Her skin felt too tight. Her reflection in the water stopped looking like her. One day she woke up and her decision was made, not out of faith, out of desperation. She had to obey, because disobedience meant losing her mind. So she lied to her parents. She packed a tunic, cut her hair like a boy, and stepped into the world not as a saint, but as a scared girl hoping she wasn't insane. When people later called her divine, they didn't know that she had walked for miles on bleeding feet, wondering if each step would be her last. They didn't know how many times she had wished to disappear before anyone noticed her, how the screams in her head drowned out the real ones. Before Jeanne carried a sword, she carried silence. A silence packed with shame, with terror, with a secret she could never explain. This wasn't the story of a warrior. This was the birth of a girl who was haunted, and no one, not even history, was ready for the horror that followed. She was never supposed to be a warrior. Jeanne was the daughter of farmers born into mud and toil. The most she should have hoped for was a quiet life, marriage, children, prayers at dawn, and a grave beside her mother. But France was broken, cities burned, villages bled. Kings hid behind stone walls while the English trampled the soil like it belonged to them. And the voices wouldn't stop. They screamed now, not whispers, not dreams. Orders, demands, visions of banners dripping in sunlight and fields slick with blood. Jeanne was 16. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked. And still she stood before a commander in armor and told him the impossible. God has sent me. I am to lead France to victory. They laughed. Of course they laughed. She was a girl with dirt under her nails and a fire in her eyes. She wore no badge, carried no sword, but she did not flinch. Her gaze never dropped. She spoke like thunder trapped in a throat too small to hold it. They didn't give her command, not right away. First they tested her, mocked her, tried to scare her. But every priest, every noble, every armored knight who looked into her eyes came away shaken. She saw things they could not. And when the Dauphin heard of her, he summoned her to court. She walked into the royal palace dressed like a peasant and left it holding prophecy. The future king disguised himself to test her. She walked past the courtiers, past the games, and fell to her knees before the right man. She pointed to him without hesitation and said, "You are the heir of France. God has sent me to crown you." Everything changed. They gave her armor, they gave her men, they gave her a sword forged in legend and prayers, pulled from behind an altar in a forgotten chapel. It had waited for her, like the stories promised. She mounted a horse like it was born beneath her. Clumsy at first, but possessed. She learned to ride with steel on her back and war on her mind. Every step she took, the soldiers began to believe, not in her skill, but in her purpose. When she rode into battle, the sky turned dark. Thunder cracked like a war drum, and they followed. Her first victory came at Orléans, a city choked by siege and despair. For months, the people starved while the English mocked them from across the river. No one thought salvation would come from a girl in white armor. But it did. Jeanne led the charge, not from the rear, from the front. Arrow fire rained from the sky. Blood soaked the mud. A banner bearing Christ flapped in her hands like judgment itself. When she was struck, she rose again, bleeding, pale, but unbroken. Orléans fell to France, and the myth of Jeanne was born. Men sang of her in taverns, women whispered her name into cradles. The sick clutched scraps of her cloak like relics. But the church grew uneasy. A girl claiming divine orders? A girl dressing like a man? There was no room in scripture for that kind of miracle. And still, she won. She led the army through enemy towns, praying louder than swords could clash. She inspired cowards to stand and kings to kneel. She raised the siege at Patay, reclaimed Reims, and led the Dauphin to his coronation. She did what entire generations of men had failed to do, and she was 17, but power breeds fear, and Jeanne's victories made her dangerous. She wasn't noble-born. She wasn't trained. She claimed to hear God louder than the bishops ever had. Every time she triumphed, she cracked the foundation of the world the priests had built. The court that once embraced her began to murmur. Was she a witch? A demon? Was this truly God's work or something darker? But Jeanne did not slow. She rode further into enemy territory, into villages swallowed by plague and war. She sat beside dying children and still saw glory, still saw France reborn. At the gates of Paris, she begged the crown to let her strike. The Dauphin hesitated. He feared what she might awaken. He feared what he could not control. Jeanne marched anyway. Her banner rose like a blade of light. Her sword rang out against iron. She climbed the battlement, screaming like a beast of flame. She was struck again and again. But even wounded, even crawling, she pointed upward and shouted, "France lives!" The soldiers wept. The nobles stayed silent. This was no saint. This was a girl set on fire, and she would either save her country or burn with it. She was victorious, revered, touched by God, or so they said. Jeanne d'Arc had led armies, crowned a king, and shattered the boundaries of her sex and station. But in the end, it wasn't the English who truly destroyed her. It was betrayal, from within. The tides of war were turning. France, once on its knees, was rising again. And Jeanne, she was no longer a pawn. She was becoming a symbol, dangerous, independent, unpredictable. That terrified the men who held the reins of power. They whispered behind thick stone walls and beneath cathedral domes. Her voices, they claimed, were no longer holy. Her courage was now called arrogance. Her command, an inconvenience. The king she had lifted to the throne turned his face away. When Jeanne was captured near Compiègne in 1430, she had been promised reinforcements. They never came. She was sold, like livestock, handed to the English by Burgundian allies, her own countrymen. Dragged through mud, bound by iron, mocked by those who once cheered her. The banner she once raised now lay trampled in the bloodied fields. Her armor had been stripped, her name smeared. Not a single French noble lifted a finger. No rescue mission, no letters of protest, no royal decree. Silence. Jeanne was imprisoned not in a gilded cell, but a dungeon of stone and cold. Her guards were not respectful enemies, they were tormentors. They watched her bathe, starved her, threatened her with rape, left her in chains even when sick. She who once inspired thousands now wept alone, abandoned. And then came the trial, a political theater masked in holy robes. 70 charges: heresy, witchcraft, cross-dressing, rebellion. They hurled scripture like daggers, demanded answers that twisted her words, and refused to let her speak without traps. She stood without legal counsel. She could not read, yet they made her sign her own condemnation. The French king, her king, said nothing. No appeals, no mercy, just silence. Her saints no longer spoke to her, or maybe she could no longer hear them over the clang of chains and the cruelty of men. And still she resisted. She denied the lies, declared her visions holy, refused to betray the divine truth she had been given. But eventually even Jhon bent under pressure. She signed a confession, forced, confused, alone. For a moment they spared her, imprisoned her for life. No flames, no fire, but then she made a mistake. She wore men's clothes again, perhaps to protect herself from rape. Perhaps because her jailers left her no choice. They used it as proof she had returned to sin. Her reprieve vanished. They declared her a relapsed heretic, and the sentence was death. Her hands were bound, her body dragged to the stake, her hair shorn, her voice hoarse. She walked through the streets of Rouen like a ghost in daylight. Crowds came. Some laughed, some cried, some looked away. They burned her like a witch, but feared her like a queen. She was 19. The betrayal was complete, not only of Jeanne, but of every ideal she had fought for. Her courage was politicized, her purity weaponized, her faith twisted until it became her undoing. And when the flames took her, the smoke did not rise with peace. It rose with shame. She was dragged into the courtroom not as a warrior, but as a prisoner. Her feet chained, her face pale, her eyes hollow. The girl who once rode with fire in her soul now stood before men in black robes who wielded ink and scripture like weapons. She was just 19. The room was cold, the stone walls absorbing what little warmth remained. High above, stained glass saints looked down, frozen in silent judgment. The men seated around her were not priests of compassion, but prosecutors in disguise, servants of power cloaked in holy garb. They did not seek truth. They sought a spectacle. They wanted her to kneel, to confess that the voices were lies, that the God who sent her was false, that she, Jeanne, the girl who defied an empire, was nothing more than a deluded girl in men's clothes. But she didn't break. Not then. She sat straight-backed as they hurled their accusations. Witchcraft, heresy, cross-dressing. Each word laced with venom, each question a trap. The English wanted her dead, but they needed the church to pull the trigger. And the church obeyed. No lawyer defended her. No ally stood by her side. The trial was a performance staged to justify an execution. They barred the public, twisted her words, forged the transcripts. When she cried, they wrote she was mad. When she stayed silent, they called it defiance. Her judges sneered when she said the voices came from heaven. They asked if God spoke in French. They mocked the very faith they claimed to serve. But still, she held on, until the fear of the flames became too much. They showed her the scaffold, the wood piled high, the ropes, the executioner sharpening his blade, and in that moment, a girl who had faced arrows and cannon fire trembled. So she signed, a single signature to save her life, a confession written in ink but soaked in shame. She agreed to wear a dress again, to renounce the visions, to stay in the church's prison, no longer a soldier but a sinner seeking forgiveness. They thought she was defeated, but they were wrong. Days later, they found her in the prison cell wearing men's clothes once more. When asked why, she said the voices had returned, that she could not betray them again, that God had not abandoned her. So the court ruled, relapse. Her soul was lost, her fate was sealed. They sentenced her to burn. Not because she was a threat to heaven, but because she had become a symbol on earth. A poor girl who had proven that courage did not come from titles, that holiness did not live only in cathedrals, that men in robes and crowns could be challenged and shamed by a teenage girl with conviction. They could not let her live, so they lit the fire, and in doing so they tried to erase her. But ashes speak, and Jeanne d'Arc's voice still echoes in every courtroom where truth is twisted, in every trial where power hides behind righteousness, in every moment when the innocent are crushed by those who claim moral authority. This was not justice. It was murder by ritual. A teenage girl burned not for her sins, but for her strength. They tied her hands with rope so rough it tore into her skin. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She was 19 and exhausted. The square was already full, packed with bodies buzzing with whispers. But no one met her eyes. Jeanne d'Arc, once the girl who heard angels, now stood chained before a wooden pillar, surrounded by kindling silence and fear. The soldiers avoided her gaze. Even the priest beside her hesitated. A scaffold was built not to kill, but to make people watch. And the people watched, not as spectators, but as cowards hiding behind crosses in doubt. She asked for a cross to hold. They handed her one hastily carved from firewood. Her fingers trembled as she clutched it. She kissed it once. Her lips left a stain of blood. The judge read her sentence aloud, but his voice wavered. Her name, Jeanne, echoed over the crowd like a warning, not a judgment. She looked up. Smoke was already rising from the straw beneath her. The sky was gray, no thunder, no divine rescue, just silence. And then fire. It licked the edges first, the hem of her dress, the soles of her feet. She gritted her teeth, not from pain, but from defiance. They wanted her to scream. She closed her eyes and whispered prayers instead. Prayers no one dared to repeat. The priest held a crucifix high, hoping she'd recant, but she never did. She burned, believing she was right. Some say the fire danced around her face, leaving it untouched until the very end. Others say her heart would not burn. But what is certain, what history could not erase, is that the flames consumed a body, not a voice. And that voice has never stopped echoing. Jeanne was not erased. She was seared into the conscience of a nation, into the guilt of every man who watched her die, into the fear of every man who feared a girl too brave to bow. Her ashes did not scatter. They took root. And today we do not mourn Jeanne's death. We live in its shadow. They burned her to silence her. But they failed. Jeanne d'Arc's scream didn't end in Rouen. It echoed, through time, through stone, through the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals that once condemned her. The execution was supposed to be a finale, but instead it birthed a myth. The girl they once called a witch became a saint. The same voices that called for her death would centuries later whisper prayers in her name. That's the twist that history never saw coming. Those who lit the fire, those men in robes and armor and crowns, believed they were cleansing France of heresy. They didn't realize they were branding themselves into infamy. Because Jeanne didn't die alone. She died with truth strapped to her body like kindling. The flames didn't consume her. They revealed her. Her legacy wasn't built on blood. It was forged in betrayal and fire and fear. And that legacy twisted into something no one expected. In the years after her death, France changed. Slowly, bitterly, but it changed. The men who once mocked her began to tremble at her memory. Her name became harder to ignore, harder to erase. The church that condemned her, it canonized her. The crown that abandoned her, it wrapped her image in glory, and still she haunted them. They saw her face in every rebellion that followed, in every peasant who rose against a sword, in every woman who dared to speak. Jeanne was no longer a girl. She had become an idea, and ideas are bulletproof. But this legacy isn't simple, it's twisted. Because behind the sainthood, behind the statues, behind the stained glass depictions of divine light, there was always a girl who wept, who begged, who bled, a girl whose body was turned to ash while the world watched and moved on. They never found all her remains. Some say her heart wouldn't burn. Others say it was stolen, hidden by someone who believed she deserved more than fire. That single unburned relic became legend, passed in secret, protected, revered, a human heart charred but whole, kept in a golden reliquary like the beating center of a revolution too painful to forget. That's the twist, that even in death they couldn't fully destroy her. They buried her name in lies, but her legacy clawed back out. Every time a woman leads, a girl fights, or a child dares to defy an empire, Jeanne breathes again. She was a threat then. She's a threat now, because power still fears purity, and cruelty still disguises itself in ritual. Jeanne's legacy is not a fairy tale. It is a horror story wrapped in faith, in flames, and in forgiveness. But it is also a mirror, one that forces us to look, truly look, at how the powerful fear the powerless when they can no longer be controlled. She was not made a saint because she was perfect. She was made a saint because her imperfection terrified the world. And that fear lives on. That's her legacy. That's the twist. Jeanne d'Arc is a name that echoes with glory, tragedy, and divine mystery. But the deeper you look into her story, the more uncomfortable questions begin to surface. Not about her courage, not about her faith, but about us, the ones who tell her story and the ones who let her die. Because when you strip away the stained glass and hallowed hymns, What you find is a frightened teenage girl led to the stake by powerful men who claim to protect her. What you find is not just a martyr, but a symbol of how easily faith can be manipulated, how easily bravery can be betrayed. And perhaps most chilling of all, how easily the people, the very crowd who once cheered her victories, fell silent when the fire was lit. The church that blessed her sword turned and called her a heretic. The crown she helped restore chose silence over salvation. And the people she died for watched. This is not just a story of sainthood, it's a story of silence. Jeanne was burned publicly so that her voice could be buried permanently. But the ashes would not settle. They rose like smoke into the eyes of history, forcing generation after generation to ask, why? Why was a child trusted with divine visions only to be discarded like a pawn in someone else's game? Why did her faith inspire both awe and fear? Why do we sanctify her now when we stood aside then? Every retelling of Jeanne d'Arc reveals more than just her. It reveals us. We canonize those we kill to make ourselves feel holy. We raise statues where we once raised stakes. We teach children her name without teaching them our shame. And even now, there are those who would use her image. A girl in armor, a flame-touched saint, to justify new wars, new dogmas, new control. Because Jeanne d'Arc isn't just history. She's prophecy. A mirror held up to every generation that still hasn't learned how to treat its daughters with dignity. So tell her story. But tell it honestly. Tell it with the horror she felt, the blood she shed, the silence she died in. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. It means you're listening.